Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. On the 31st of January 2020, the UK made history when it became the first country to leave the European Union. It followed a hugely contentious referendum campaign when all sorts of promises were made by both sides as to a future inside and outside Europe. But 4 years on, what exactly has changed? Joining me now are Professor Amelia Hadfield, Deane International and Head of Politics at the University of Surrey, former British Minister for Europe, Denis MacShane, and former Chief of Staff to ex-Prime Minister David Cameron, Alex Deane. Thank you all for coming on the agenda. Now, look, we all know the Brexit journey was bumpy, and we can all agree with that. But let's take stock. How has Brexit changed the UK's reputation as a place to do business, to invest in, to live in, to work in? Amelia, start with you.
I think across those points, it's pretty undeniable that Brexit hasn't been a roaring success. I think we've seen a range of different kinds of impacts, some very immediate in the first year or two after Brexit, and some still trucking on now. It's been very difficult, I think, particularly in terms of trade. And here I think I ought to mention the GVA, the gross value added. That's a measure of the size of the British economy. And just to give you highlights on that, as a result of Brexit, it's approximately £140 billion less in 2023 than it would have been if the UK had opted to remain in the customs union and the single market together. So that's a drop of about 6%. I think if you squeeze that down to look at London, for example, London's real GVA is more than £30 billion less again in 2023. So simply on the basis of trade, I think that's an enormous impact. Investment is trickier to some extent, but the idea of a warm investment climate and a welcoming investment climate, I think, has also taken a knock-on impact. I think we'll speak later on about the impact this has had for Britain in terms of its foreign policy and relations more broadly.
Alex, what do you think? Do you think Brexit has damaged or improved the UK's reputation?
Well, of course, if you judge Brexit by who people book to do talk shows, it's always 2-1 against. If you judge it based on our productive economy, and if you judge it based on our performance vis-a-vis our peers, I'd say it's good. People always like to say things like, well, GVA is down for the UK in 2023 compared to what it would have been. How on earth do you know, given we had COVID in between the two dates that people are thinking about? I think about where our standing is. Our ability, for example, to act decisively and early in support of Ukraine after Russia's invasion, when our European friends lagged way behind, is a good example of how Britain acts well for the world as an independent country. And of course, we had to fly sorties to help Ukraine around German airspace. So when the Europeans say they want to lead on foreign policy, it doesn't seem to be happening in my lifetime.
Denis, I can see you chuckling away in the background there. What are your thoughts?
I've written 5 books on Brexit. I speak French, German, Spanish. I patrol European capitals, and I see with my own eyes, my own children, my own friends, some of the negative aspects. It's not sort of Armageddon. That is silly. Germany now is spending more than the United States in terms of military aid to Ukraine. They're sending lots of Leopard tanks. We've got 140 Challenger tanks in store that could go to Ukraine. We've sent exactly 14. We sent ministers to do photo calls in Kyiv, but Alex, that is not going to worry Mr. Putin too much. Just 3 little stories I just noticed before this interview, just this weekend. Firstly, a big one of all the delicatessen stores in Britain. The shops just down from me, there's a Sicilian one, a Portuguese one where I live in London. They're now, because of new British rules, delaying and blocking the import of animal products, i.e. sausages, cheeses, things that we love in our continental delicatessens. A lot are going to have to close down because they can't afford the paperwork, the European export certificates. All of this is just microeconomics. We can't travel there. Story in the Daily Mail yesterday of a lady complaining that she had great difficulties getting the right to live in France all the year round. But she voted for Brexit. She's a British citizen. And we don't have those rights anymore to live all the year round in in Europe. And then finally, there's a slightly sort of bigger story to do indeed with trade, and that is that there is a lowering of investment. Certainly as a foreign policy bore, you can see that I specialise in the Western Balkans. Britain has no voice down there, because what matters in the Western Balkans is what's decided in Brussels, in EU capitals, and in Washington. And I'm afraid we were powerful there. Tony Blair led the coalition that got rid of Milosevic, brought an unstable peace, but at least stopped the violence in the Balkans. And now, frankly, we're completely out of the game.
Alex, do you think we're completely out of the game? I mean, is it just, hard cheese for all of these delicatessens?
No, I mean, it's a charmingly rambling position that goes from anecdote to anecdote. But we're in a time now where the Houthi rebels, at the time of recording this show, are attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea, has a material impact far beyond the kind of sausage or cheese issue that Denis was talking about. It impacts global supply chains. Britain acted immediately, and neither Germany nor Italy nor France nor Spain took part to assist in stopping one of the world's most significant terrorist activities. Hello, Denis. Thanks for waiting. One of the most significant terrorist activities in our time. Now, it may be that eventually the Europeans come about to act, but it does seem, again, that Britain's ability to operate independent of the European Union is a significant one. And when you want to talk about money, I mean, it's extraordinary, really. Europeans just borrowed 800 billion euros. Britain's contribution or debt for that, of course, we were always a contributor nation bar 1 year of our membership. We gave more than we received financially. Britain's liability for that, now that we're not in the EU, is zero. But people like to talk about processed meat.
Amelia, would things be better or worse if the UK had remained inside the European Union?
No, undoubtedly better. I'm quite sure of it, and I don't think it's easy, to be able to point to the winning aspects of Brexit in many ways. But I'm really interested in the difference, if you like, between the EU's rebound actually and UK stagnation. I think that differential is very, very important as well. And sorry, you can't take swipes at things like cheese. Food is a massive aspect of what the British economy is made up of. So is beverages and tobaccos and chemicals and material manufacturers. These are huge areas, and the UK has missed out on a big rise in European trade as a result of the border costs that Brexit has imposed. To say nothing, I think, of a lot of other items like medical equipment, where we had a prodigious advantage. Sporting goods, toys, office supplies. These are the types of goods produced by the smaller guys, by the medium and small firms. These have really struggled the most, I think, with the border costs imposed by Brexit. So UK exports in those particular categories to the EU have declined by 30%. That's just ripping out the bottom of those sorts of industries. While the intra-EU to EU trade, which is very, very interesting, that's been pretty good. That's grown by a healthy 9%. So, back to the question of the impact, it's very material, and it's certainly bound to roll on.
Alex, it's very material?
This is becoming a point, if it wasn't already, a pointless debate in which people cherry pick the things that they care about. And Germany is in recession. Britain's growth is more significant than anyone in the G7 bar the Americans, possibly the Canadians, but you'll note neither of them are in Europe. And so people prefer to talk about Europe's rebound and Britain's stagnation. It's got to the point where the exchange becomes useless. Because if people are going to assert whatever they like, it's no longer even just a disagreement over economic statistics. It's taking a position which is no longer justifiable and dressing it up as a pseudo-academic or a pseudo-profound one.
I don't think total goods exports of 13.5% is cherry picking. 13.4 billion on a quarterly basis.
Germany's in recession and Britain isn't. Did you know that's the example you want to point to?
Well, as every commentator says, Germany certainly is going through a dip at the moment. There are big farmer strikes in France. They're proposing to surround Paris with tractors and all the rest of it. Just as we had great fuel drivers strikes, we've had the longest strike wave of transport and health ever in our history. I don't think actually it's related to Brexit.
No, not at all.
Talking about any more than Germany being in the EU is giving it a temporary dip, but most economists and most public healthcare workers and most professionals and most workers would give anything to be employed and living under German standards of life or Dutch
So let's talk about people. Let's talk about that workforce, Denis, because London's mayor has called for young people to be able to move freely to and from the EU, as people in the UK were able to before Brexit. That's going to lessen, he says, the cultural and the economic damage caused by that decision. What do you think that cultural as well as economic damage has been by restricting people's movements?
Very simply, we've denied all of our children the right to take part in Erasmus. Those were a very simple, low-level thing for school leavers to go and do another year in another country. I don't think we've got a single member of the cabinet now that speaks a European language. I'm not sure we have in the opposition as well. And I'm not just making a Tory point here. We've completely internalized, become inward-looking, and so we're just losing touch in so many ways. We've been forced to rejoin Horizon, that's the big scientific program, but it still puts huge barriers to any European academic coming here.
Alex, I want to talk to you about the outlook for UK jobs. I mean, there's this independent study by Cambridge Econometrics. It showed that London has 250,000 fewer jobs than if Brexit had not happened, with half of the total 2 million job losses nationwide coming from the financial services sector and the construction sector.
What are you talking about?
What is statistics? This is an independent study. So what's your outlook for jobs? It's short-term pain for long-term gain?
More people went to work in the United Kingdom this morning than have ever gone to work in Britain in the history of our country. You're talking about theoretical job losses when the workforce is larger than ever. There are still more jobs in the city than there were before we left the European Union, and the British labour force is at an all-time high. When you claim there are 2 million, you just said there were 2 million absent jobs. British labour force is larger than it's ever been. What is the point now of this conversation? And to have smirkingly wry commentators who seemingly, with your agreement, saying I should get my head out of my sandpit, it's no longer a meaningful discourse.
To be clear, I'm quoting from a recent independent study by Cambridge Econometrics. It's a respected institution. I'm not pulling figures out of thin air.
Does Britain now have a larger workforce than it ever has before, or not?
Every country has. I mean, in America, it's far bigger.
But how can you claim there are fewer jobs? It's just ridiculous.
Well, go up to Rotherham.
I know, Denis. It wasn't your claim.
Go up to Liverpool, and there's the pay they're getting. The fact that so many have to be on benefits, the fact that so many have to, even in rich London, where I'm speaking from, SW1, there's a food bank down the road, because the people who live on the council flats, social housing behind them, can't get decent paid jobs. Now, that's part of the difficulty, and I just think we should all be a bit more moderate and modest. We're not going back. I mean, the way Alex is going on, as if he's facing, I'm going to have to sort of go and work and live in Europe again. No, we're not going back.
There comes a point where between impressions of what I'm apparently like and saying I should get out of my sandpit, this is no longer a productive conversation.
Well, I'm sorry, if you're not prepared to take strong riposte...
OK, Alex, OK, then let's put it right and tell us why you think the UK is now more attractive in terms of investment, in terms of luring foreign investors. Because when I'm looking at it, I'm seeing that China's BYD, the world's largest seller of electric and hybrid cars, is ruling out its first European factory in the UK because of Brexit. When we are reading and hearing about stories like that, you're thinking, OK, what is making us an attractive proposition as a nation?
The same people, I don't know about your position, but I certainly know about Denis's, and I imagine I can guess the professors, the same people who told us we'd have 500,000 unemployed and an immediate recession if we dared to leave the European Union, hung their arguments, at least in part, on the fact that industries like car manufacturing will collapse. We're making more cars in the United Kingdom, a kind of point people don't seem to care about because they can say X manufacturer has said they won't invest. We did 3 rounds of ping pong with major manufacturers like that in the United Kingdom. They're still here and they're still making cars. People made claims about huge amounts of unemployment. There are more jobs in this country than ever. It's got to the point, I'm afraid, where people are seeking to talk down the United Kingdom so that they can be right, rather than see their country do well and their arguments and past positions will be wrong. They do it shamelessly, And then they do it. It's quite smugly, because it seems that that's the only conversation they have around their dinner party conversation.
Amelia, I think Amelia needs to have her say and talk about the impact of foreign investment. Did you agree with? Go on.
I'd like to talk up the UK, actually, because it's I think it's a more realistic proposition, particularly in terms of foreign policy. But I think we have to do it reasonably on the basis of things like ONS, which is probably where the employability stats were drawn from the Cambridge Econometrics. I've read that report. It's just entirely reasonable to me. If we could talk about a couple of service areas, perhaps this will help break it down a bit. So telecoms and IT, insurance, which Britain's very, very well known for, pensions, all of the sort of business services, if you like. These are a series that contain consultancy and accounting and legal services. They've actually grown really fast. They have grown faster in the UK than the average of advanced economies since Brexit. So excellent, great. You know, there's an area of benefit. Perhaps we can see ways in which in the next 2, 5, 10 years you might be able to stagger increased investment climate. But others have not. So the financial services, they have grown more weakly in the UK than elsewhere since the start of 2020, when many financial services companies based in the UK started setting up operations in the EU. And I think probably quite rightly they knew which side of the bread their butter was on. The other is transport services, and this is really tricky because in many ways is the sinews between us and the European Union. That's the category that of course contains road haulage and shipping. Like financial services, growth in British exports of transport services they're well down. They're well down in comparison to other advanced economies. And that's probably because Britain's goods exports to the EU obviously have been hit. That in turn reduces demand for British lorry driver services. And it's tricky for the British lorry drivers because they can't do what's cabotage within the EU. They can't move goods between member states. So, you know, there's a credible call at this point to talk about the relationships going forward between the UK and the EU. And the time is now, because this is the year 2024 where we need to get our ducks in a row to look again at the trade and cooperation agreement, which is due for renegotiation in 2025. So this is a way in which to look at reclaiming and recalibrating and strengthening the relationship between the UK and the European Union in key areas like trade, in goods and services and investment, and possibly more widely in terms of foreign policy. And it's true to say that I think Britain has demonstrated very real leadership around the world in key areas, and Ukraine's a good one. But it's also lost areas of very real respect and trust and confidence. I think it's still working very hard to get past the diplomatic Brexit bruises, if I can call it that, particularly in the UNSC and particularly other areas, perhaps like the Commonwealth. So it's a living process, and we're going to be able to see how that goes and translates in the next 2 and 5 years. But it's a long one. It's definitely a long-term one.
So let's talk about moving forward, because you talked about some diplomacy, and one area that maybe we can all agree, it seems to be one where nations tend to agree more on, or it's a starting point, is climate change. So, Alex, let's talk about the green transition. Because experts say the UK is quietly diverging from EU environmental law, and in some areas there's a bit of a danger of the UK going backwards. I mean, the Environment Secretary, though, Steve Barclay, says Brexit gives us more freedom. So what is really going on here?
Britain has produced more of an emissions reduction, halved our emissions from the 2010 numbers, has halved our emissions, and all global observers agree that Britain is the developed economy that's done the most to reduce our emissions.
The UK signed up to EU environmental standards and goals and is kind of doing its own thing. Is that because of Brexit? Does it matter? Are you saying that the UK is going faster and that the EU should catch up? What we're trying to establish here is how Brexit has benefited not just the UK economy, but all of these challenges that we're facing.
Yes, but along the way, I think you've got to base your conversation not on, I heard somewhere that somebody reckoned Britain was doing badly because they weren't in the EU. Professor Hadfield had a completely reasonable point. We left a club. Some people won't like it. It's a bruising process and it's a long-term one. But Britain was the first G7 country to halve its carbon emissions. And that's less than half the 652 million tonne peak from 1970. And in the last 11 years, our annual emissions have dropped significantly again, some 35% down. So Emissions by sector are down in the United Kingdom. Our Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit suggests we've cut our total greenhouse gas emissions by over 40% from the 1990 peak. I mean, why on earth would you suggest Britain's going backwards? We are the #1 performing economy on the G20 in cutting emissions.
Well, that's probably doesn't quite explain why a coroner gave air pollution as the cause of death of a 4-year-old girl in London. The area
in a case, air quality in London is better than it's ever been.
Amelia, maybe you can help me with this one. Given that AI is the foundational future of everything. Last year, the head of Facebook said that because of Brexit, the UK can go its own way on AI, and the UK's lighter touch approach than the EU's tougher stance in terms of regulation makes it more attractive to internet companies and to investors. So do you think that the UK has the potential to do it better?
I think there was a part of the Brexit narrative that suggested that the sort of offshore quality of Britain was going to be really comprehensively reaped, the sort of offshore Singapore or Hong Kong, if you like. And this has to do with the tightness with which the UK was going to be linked in or not to the EU's regulatory framework. And, to some extent, there's a sense that if you are devoid of all of the links with the European Union in terms of laws and directives and regulations, yes, I mean, you can forge your own way. Interestingly, in climate change, and I'll just come back to this, it hasn't prevented the current government from U-turning on a number of things. And it might do so temporarily, but it's still at this point in the slipstream of expectations by the United Nations. We're all going to have to abide by these, and these are increasingly stringent. And it's also good. It's going to have to work with its largest continental partner, the European Union. So I think you can tweak with some of the regulatory edges, if you like. AI is another very, very good example. It might be able to shift in terms of the investment climate and some aspects of the way in which it wants to develop, invest, and possibly regulate AI in the UK. But ultimately, this is an absolutely enormous area, and it will be dominated by the people who write the rules. And at that point, that's the United States on the one side, the European Union in the middle, and increasingly China. So the UK is not a large enough market to be able to dominate the rulemaking. So it will have to find out what makes the most sense to AI development domestically, and pitch its wagon behind any of those available 3 stars. Let's put it like that.
I think Professor Hadfield has a completely reasonable point about not taking advantage of the opportunities posed by being able to frame your own regulatory environment. And we did think coming into the Brexit process that Britain would take more use of its independent status to diverge and have different regulations. And largely speaking, so far, that hasn't happened. In most fields, Britain hasn't put in place its own new rules in a way one might have imagined an independent country would do. And I think that, so first of all, I think that's fair. But secondly, I think that there is a significant risk that, we don't need the European Union to make mistakes. Britain can do it all on our own. And it may be that we overcompensate, gold plate, impose additional regulation. There is as much instinct in this country to regulate and impose new rules as there is to deregulate and to free up markets. So whilst we haven't really seen significant new rules on AI in any market yet, my concern would be that Britain becomes a market leader in trying to strangle too much rather than the other way around.
Well, so you want to keep the UK open for business. Go ahead, Denis.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a very fair point. But we have tried, or at least the government's tried, produced a mammoth bill with thousands of regulations to replace every single EU regulation by a UK one made in UK, even though most of those regulations are for Margaret Thatcher's single market and were shaped by British civil servants, politicians, officials, and the rest of it, except for the sensible by the rest of Europe. They tried for about a year to get this through the Commons, and it collapsed in on itself because the chemical industry, the plastics industry, automobile industry all said, for God's sake, we don't need English regulations to tell us what to do. We want to sell our goods in the international market. Europe, that's EU. America and the European regulations are aligning. Stop wasting parliamentary time. And to be fair to Rishi Sunak, he did simply give up on that, as he's given up on a few other sillier of the Brexit ideas. And bit by bit, my prediction is we're not going to rejoin. There's not going to be a new referendum. Don't worry, Alex. You'll not have to worry about being a European citizen or anything. We will get to the stage of just common sense in a very old-fashioned British can-do way applying, and we'll try and find ways of reconnecting with Europe. It's going to be hard. It's going to be long. at Norway, look at Switzerland. It's not going to be easy, but it's the way forward. And we actually should just all grow up instead of saying, Jarl Boo sucks, the guys who voted for Brexit are terrible, the guys who support Brexit are terrible, everybody is a liar except me. That kind of debate is just no longer relevant. Stop refighting 2016. You won, the country lost, we now have to move on.
So let's have a final thought from all of you. How do you see the Brexit effect continuing in the future? Amelia?
I think, as I mentioned before, it is going to require recalibration with the European Union. That's undoubted, and I think actually that will benefit Britain. This ironically could be post-Brexit dividend as you restart the relationships, but it's going to be very difficult because particularly from foreign policy perspective, it's from a standing start, and that's an unusual position for Britain as a diplomatic leader actually to find itself in. But I'm optimistic that reworking the trade and partnership agreement over the course of the next couple of years will generate real dividends for Britain.
So recalibrate from a standing start. I can see you shaking your head there, Denis.
I agree with Amelia. It's actually a lovely expression. Les absents toujours tort. If you're absent, you're in the wrong. We're never in the wrong these days. And for me, as a foreign policy guy, I just think that is completely and utterly crazy. Leave that to one side. I don't think, Amelia, it will be that easy. Because I control European capitals, and they say, well, yes, it'd be nice to have youth mobility schemes, but are you going to accept all of our young people? Oh, no, it's just one way, and that doesn't work. So I think the interesting thing for me is, assuming there's a Labour government, I'm not entirely sure of that at all, but assuming that's what the polls are saying, then Keir Starmer, as of later this autumn, he will own Brexit, and an awful lot of people, especially in business, especially those who were under that politically more on the right, close to the Conservatives, didn't want to rock the boat, rely on government for planning permissions and grants and so on. They're going to say, Sir Keir Starmer, Labour, you're messing up our interests because you're keeping us out of Europe. That will be a big change in politics, because when the Labour Party was told 30 years ago, stop being anti-European, it grew up and started winning elections. And I think when the Tories want to win elections, they've got to get real about Europe.
Alex, I'm going to give you the last word.
And I think there are some fair points that have been made. It's always going to be a bruising process when you leave an organisation. But Britain is no less European for having decided to be our own sovereign country, govern ourselves, and to leave the European Union. I wish the member states of the European Union and indeed the institution itself well. We've decided to govern ourselves, and I'm glad of that. It's going to be a challenging environment for Britain, but it was going to be challenging either way. And I think we're better off being able to make our decisions for ourselves.
Alex Deane, Amelia Hadfield, Denis MacShane, thank you all very much.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.